I can't wear white because these things happen. Usually, in the past, it was because a kid, of our 5 to On Purpose would do something. It doesn't matter if they just give me a hug with like a face full of breakfast or spit up or whatever it is. And now that our youngest is approaching 4, I thought, I can wear white again. It's not true. I can't control my own drippage of any kind. So. As we talk about how a job interview needs like a good solid outfit to feel good about, you want to feel, not insecure. Now I'm starting today insecure about what you guys are staring at. So I'm going to put this extra high today, so those of you. All right, we're in Acts. So if you're just joining us, we've been in the book of Acts. Today is the last message of this series on Acts. We're kind of doing a little bit of backtracking. We did Acts 26 last week. We're now going to be in kind of end of Acts 21 and beginning of Acts 22. But this is a passage where Paul is on trial again. That's kind of a constant theme. But there's a couple themes in the book of Acts I just want to remind us of, and if you're joining us for the first time, the book of Acts is a very unique book. It comes right after the Gospels. It was written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And in the book of Acts, you see several things about the launching of the early church. You first see a people, Acts 2, the Spirit descends, and now there's the entire company of the church is prophesying. That symbolizes the qualification of those empowered to do and continue Christ's ministry is everyone. That's a radical and controversial arena. Paul's actually on trial here among the Jews because they still are holding on to this idea that we are so special as Jews that apparently we're going to have a couple different things happening today, one of which is Siri is talking to me randomly. So it's never happened before. The reality is that Paul is sitting there among Jews that are accusing him of going after the Gentiles in a way he's not supposed to. But the way he addresses them and the way he addresses Athens and the way he addresses every single time he gets up in front of a company of people uniquely, there's a way that he does it that should cut us to the heart. So there's a couple things in the book of Acts that we're meant to see. It's one that every single one of us is qualified. We still wrestle with this today. We get into comparison mode. I just absolutely love the testimony that Sarah started with so often, even in the modern church, we've gotten rid of so much of religiosity, for lack of a better term. It doesn't mean it's all gone. But there are still kind of cultural Christian norms. Here's what it looks like to be a really good evangelist. Here's what it looks like to be a really good intercessor. Here's what it looks like to be a really good preacher. Here's what this looks like to be a good Christian. Here's the personality type that is what we highlight, or that gets a stage, or that gets a voice, or that gets a following. And then what gets lost is those that don't fit into that mold. And many of the quiet ones, or many of the ones that are a little bit different, or many of the ones that don't seem to resonate with the core dominant voices, sometimes sit on the periphery or the fringes and wonder, what is it that I'm meant to take part in, other than just believing and doing the best I can and kind of staying in my little corner or in my lane. And what Acts is meant to do is disrupt that. It's meant to disrupt every conviction that you have that leaves you on the sidelines, that disqualifies you, or that looks to some other gift, some other personality type, or some other way that you can't possibly live up to or replicate or follow. The way of Jesus is so beautiful, profound, and impossible. And yet it includes you, and it includes me, it includes your personality, it includes your gifts. And the book of Acts continually takes the focus back to how do you see yourself on mission? And how do you view your current circumstances? And how are they taking you out? There's 3 things I want us to look at today. Paul brings up this human condition. No human gets to avoid difficulty. Here are the questions. How do you face extreme circumstances? And how does our faith shape those moments? If you look at the most pressing situations that you're maybe currently facing, have faced, or know may be happening in the future. If you don't know how your faith is the underworking core foundation of how you address those, you're living beneath your privileges as a follower of Jesus. The greatest privilege of one who follows Jesus is that in life's most pressing circumstances, I know exactly how my faith strengthens me when I am weak. There's this concept in the Old Testament called the fear of the Lord. I used to hate it when I was kind of coming out of religious mindsets because I was just like, it just seemed like such a gross, bad interpretation. And the more I realize, most of life is about dealing with certain kinds of fears. What we worship is really about the things that we fear the most. If you fear not being successful, that's what you probably are worshiping. The idols of our hearts are usually the things that we fear the most. Fearing acceptance, you want acceptance. Fearing not being successful, you go after achievement. You're fearing relational dynamics, being alone. What do you go after? The fear of the Lord is that above all the other things that we can fear and do fear and will fear, not that we don't fear anything else, it's that there's an order to our fears because there's an order to our loves, because there's an anchoring to our hearts. And when God grasps your heart, when you've encountered his kind of sacrificial love, it grips you, it reorients you, it sustains you, and it reorders you. It reorders your loves, it reorders your fears. And what Paul is demonstrating here is how the story of the gospel transforms a life. The beginning of Acts 2, the Spirit descends and falls. Then we see in Acts 7, the first martyr, the first follower of Jesus, Stephen, who's not a big somebody. He's just been voted in as a deacon. And in the midst of that, as a deacon, he's murdered. I can talk over it. He'll be fine. Yes. The first martyr. And it says, those who murdered him, stoned him to death, they laid their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. Of course, most of you know Saul is the man who would become the Apostle Paul, who is the most prolific apostle and writer of the New Testament. We have here in Acts 22, Paul, who is time and again here referring back to Stephen. Not just he'll refer to it at the end of this passage, but the beginning of the speech, what he says and what he knows and is in the back of his mind is that his fate is likely going to end in the same way. And his entire story that connects us to Stephen's story, that connects us to Jesus' story, and to the grand story that we're living our lives toward, is an invitation to say, do you even know how your story connects to this one? Paul knew beyond anything else that his life had been transformed. He had an identity as a Jew. He had an identity as a Roman citizen. He had an identity even as a Jew that wasn't just the kind of the radicalized, Pharisaical, learned one, which he was because he was trained in Jerusalem and Judea, but he was born outside of Jerusalem. They call that the diaspora, meaning that there were multiple kinds of Jews even in Jerusalem, and he could relate and identify with both of them. His identity was based on multiple things that are all circulating here that we'll see in a moment. And the reality is that you have multiple things that form your identity, but the core anchor of the way of Jesus is that you get a new identity that anchors you. And a new identity says, the story you've been living has been completely reoriented around a bigger story. Your story isn't about you, it's about something and someone else. And when you can see your story, when you are willing to align your story and submit your story to this bigger, grander story, then you have something that you can lay your life down for. You have a vision that's bigger than your own life. You have a future that's secure. And when you remember that future, when you trust that story, you practice the way of this rabbi named Jesus, And it becomes very relevant in the cultural tensions of 2024, and the same as it was at the time of this Second Temple Judaism in the time of the Apostle Paul. So here's the context. Two people want him dead. Two groups of people want Paul dead. The Jews, because he refuses to cater to them, and they think that he wants to abandon the people of the Jewish people, the temple, the Mosaic law, and he refuses to impose Jewish practices on the Gentiles. We saw that a few weeks back. They needed a plan, the leaders in Jerusalem, to show that Paul was loyal, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. So what they suggested that he would do is that he took this Nazirite vow. And without going into too much detail about that, you actually have to shave your head at the end of that Nazirite vow. And in light of that, he also paid for 4 other men who were in the midst of that Nazirite vow. In the middle of that ceremony, the one he paid for, not just his, but 4 other Jewish men, they grab him and beat him close to death. And at the same time, the other group that think that he's something else want him dead. So at the same time, there's the Roman sentries mistake him for an Egyptian revolutionary that's been involved in urban terrorism. And so the Egyptians often shave their heads, and so they think that he might be one of those Egyptian terrorists. And so he's actually being pulled out of the mob because of the Roman sentries thinking that might be the case. So in the middle of the ceremony, he's dragged out and beaten. But we're going to look at 3 things. We're going to look in the midst of difficulty. Paul looks and gives us 3 elements that I want us to see in our own lives. He gives us a view into our expectations, our language, and our identity. Our expectations are ultimately our mindset. Paul expects trials. Secondly, the language, our actions. He speaks the language of the people in multiple contexts and in multiple ways, and emphasizes first not their differences but their commonalities. This should hit us. When we think of the ways that we're engaging with the culture out there, do we start with the commonalities or do we start with the differences? Do you lead even in your own heart and your soul with the differences or the commonalities? Thirdly, identity. That's the transformation story. Paul was so ingrained and set in the reality that his story had been transformed that it absolutely enabled him beyond his personal capacity to be unoffended in the midst of his life, holding on like a whispering grasp. He can't be offended. Why? Because his heart has been anchored in another realm, in another world. And when we find ourselves unable to be the peacemaker, peacemakers are not people that avoid conflict or are ambivalent towards it. We looked last week at some of the dynamics, Barna studies today, that are showing that most of the church is either avoidant or ambivalent towards their faith for many different reasons, but the core reasons being because it's like things have just been so conflicted and we don't want that, which a lot of us resonate with, or we just don't really know how to hold on to it and care. But in the light of that, we have a culture right now where 77% of the population is spiritually interested and more interested than they were before the pandemic. There is a spiritual hunger. We can see it through the cultural airwaves. People are talking about Christianity. In fact, the people that are preaching the gospel most effectively are those that don't have Christian language, that are discovering the way of Jesus for the first time and are just trying to process it, and in their process, they're vulnerably letting it out to the airwaves. Some of the things that I can't stand about social media is how just like people that shouldn't be talking have a microphone. But the most beautiful thing about social media, YouTube, podcasts, whatever it is that it's impossible to control the airwaves. And so, whoever can afford a phone, put their thoughts out there. And one of the things that I find that has shifted significantly is people aren't looking for voices that have it all together. People are looking for voices that are vulnerably asking questions and processing. for lack of looking like I'm taking sides, I've noticed that some of the biggest podcasts that people listen to and that influence the most people, typically the host. Now, we can all find the hosts that make us cringe, and you're like, how do they have a following? And I'm like, well, because obnoxious people find obnoxious people. It's like, it's not that hard to figure out. So just put them aside for a moment. But when you think of maybe more influential voices that have come up through things like podcasts, for instance, I think what resonates deepest are the kinds of hosts that can almost play stupid, meaning like they're willing to act like they don't know, because then the audience feels like they can take that posture, and the questions that are asked of the people they're interacting with are real. It's not just so prescriptive and it's so like up there that you can't resonate. It's like that host ends up being your curious voice, your processing voice. And I think the in the midst of the political spirit that just keeps people on left and right, black and white and everything else, it's fascinating to watch some of these people that are really not qualified maybe in terms of our traditional journalism and having an educated side. All of a sudden, if they're the kinds of people that can listen and process and draw other people in to a conversation, it's fascinating the influence that they have, but it's fascinating what's resonating with the culture. And what's resonating with the culture is that people are spiritually curious. And if you and I do not take hold of the opportunity that the way of Jesus gives us, that each of us is qualified to engage in a world that is hungry to know if there's a God, is he distant? Or is there a way to have a closeness with him? Much of the philosophical thought throughout the ages, even the major ones, Greek thought and down the line, it would make huge progress in understanding certain things about the human capacity and strong eating the weak and these things, but it still always kept a God at a distance. Notice when Paul goes to Athens, the home of the great philosophers, he emphasizes this isn't a God that's distant. He wants to know you. The resurrection was an act of intimate love, sacrificial love. Here in Jerusalem, the resurrection has stirred up a bit of a curiosity and a following. It's not as controversial as the Gentile. So he doesn't emphasize the resurrection nearly as much as he will essentially land on the thing that hits them at the core of their heart. Because they still worshiped an element where their actions, their temple type of worship in the religious system that had developed. As an example, they had written on the entry to the temple, this was not God's command in an Old Testament law, but they had developed a religious system where it literally said death to anyone who enters that's a Gentile. And so Paul was even accused of bringing a Gentile into that place. It wasn't true, because he was still respecting customs. But he's accused of that. And in the midst of that, it exposes what was at the root of their heart's worship. And what was at the root was that they were better than other people because of their moralism and how they attained and followed the rules, the goodness, the morals. And we think that that's so foreign to us today. But we still have this underworking thing in our culture. Well, if there's a God, why, what qualifies you? Well, hopefully I've lived a pretty good life compared to everybody else. There's still an element of we feel that need to accomplish with our life something that qualifies us. And the good news is that, man, that's a lot of load to carry. And every single believer can go, yeah, I carried that load too. And I just realized I never measured up. And the way of Jesus invited me into a way of life that covered everything that I just couldn't live up to. And so as we're looking at Paul's invitation today, the invitation that he's giving each of us again is the temptation to go back into an old mindset and an old identity. But he starts not with the differences, but with the similarities and the commonalities. So we'll look at expectation, language, and identity. I already gave you a bit of the context, so let's jump in before I say the whole sermon without reading the scripture. Acts 21, verse 37. Paul was about to be brought into the barracks. He said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" This was a polite request, a formal kind of request that you could only learn in school. So that surprised the commander that he could even do that and say that and speak like that. His word order is actually very precise, and it's using alliteration. It expresses politeness and respect to the commander. And the commander's not surprised that he speaks Greek, but he's surprised at the quality of Paul's Greek. This was like a professional orator getting up in front of a bunch of people about to speak. And the commander, we know, is a native Greek because of his name. Why does that matter? That matters because all of a sudden, in mere seconds, Paul is picking up on this man's background and is responding in a polite, respectful, and effective way that's very intentional, that shows how God is using Paul's background, his knowledge, but his being led of the Spirit to, in a matter of moments, even though he should barely be functioning because he's just been beaten to an edge of his life, he's able to see this commander and treat him with love and respect in a profound, intentional way. And the commander said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Again, remember, the Jews are hating him because of his position with the Gentiles. This commander and the Romans are hating on him because they think he's an Egyptian assassin. Paul replies, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." So Paul here, his life is severely at risk, just like Stephen's was. And this is supposed to give us a picture going all the way back, one continual storyline. Those who follow Jesus are going to face incredibly dangerous and difficult circumstances. Jesus promised it, and so he's not surprised, and he's prepared in the midst of facing that fear of difficulty. His life is severely at risk, and he should be completely paralyzed with fear. Verse 40. When he'd given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. This is like an official oratory gesture. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language. And this Hebrew language, by the way, it's Aramaic, is what that is specifically saying. I like to think of this is a terrible example. I was on the edge of sharing this because to get you off topic, but I just want to give you a picture. Do you remember back when, like, Britain Has Talent or American Idol or one of those shows? They started to all of a sudden get popular. I mean, this is like 15, 20 years ago now. They got popular by like having really obscure, unassuming people all of a sudden have like unbelievable talent. I'm terrible with names. I will never forget the name Susan Boyle. Right? She was like the first. She's the GOAT. She's the GOAT of the unassuming great voices, right? And I believe she was just this 50-something, looks like she hadn't been out of her Scottish cottage maybe her entire life. But she looks like she could cook you like the warmest, most nurturing Scottish meal on a cold winter's day with a pint of Guinness or something amazing. But she also just looks like she hasn't seen a mirror, like, in her whole life. And the idea that she would have a voice that could fill a stadium was laughable. So she comes out onto the stage, and people are just, like, kind of, like, cackling, rude, or whatever else. And all of a sudden, she opens her mouth and sings, and everyone's like, hush. The camera's looking around and whatever. And now, of course, that's become a thing, and it's like all these shows try to do is get you to do that. And nothing beats Susan Boyle. Because it was like so authentic and real, like it hadn't been done before. So Paul's having a Susan Boyle moment. But I just want you to kind of see the hushedness. Like today in our bizarre culture, there's still an element of that, needing to get someone's attention, right? We need to do that during announcements. It's like sometimes it's just impossible to get your attention. You have to do something that someone will respect. So I like to start praying because it's rude in our culture to keep talking when someone's praying, right? But in their culture, it was very difficult to get people's attention. But when they saw that Paul wasn't who they thought he was. He had elements of respect knitted into his ability to draw the crowd's silence. And this is what he says. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I make now before you. And when they'd heard that he was addressing them in Hebrew or Aramaic, they became even more quiet. And what we're meant to see here, we're meant to see Paul's wisdom. He's addressing Judeans, but he acknowledges he was born in a foreign city. I mentioned this a few moments ago. He's both showing that he can relate to the people that are there in Jerusalem that are from other areas, that are kind of a different breed of Jewish people, and the people that are from there that are very religious and have been trained and are well-schooled. He was taught by Gamaliel, and he had been there and knew them. So what he's doing is he's showing you, I'm one of you. You can trust me. You can trust this story. But he's also showing that he has a love by literally addressing the people as brothers and fathers, the people that he had just been beaten to the edge of his life. He doesn't get up with sarcasm. He uses sarcasm in other places, but here, no. Here, they're forced to feel his love. Him speaking Aramaic does two things at the same time. It associates him formally and personally with his Jewish brothers, giving them a reason to calm down. And secondly, it requires the crowd to actually calm down, to hear him, because most of them are not native Aramaic speakers. It's kind of like what Latin was for so much of church history. It was kind of like the religious studies language. So many of them would have to hush to really lean in to understand what he's saying because it's not their first language. But there's a respect, he speaks Aramaic. And he says, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus, brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as you are this day. He's saying, so I'm like you. I persecuted this way to the death, meaning the way of Jesus. I persecuted them to death, binding and delivering them to prison, both men and women, as I received letters to the brothers and journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. I'm going to keep reading. I have a couple other thoughts. Verse 6, as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. I fell to the ground, heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Notice in Acts, this summary of his testimony is given multiple times. Rarely in any biblical book do you repeat something that long and detailed, multiple times. It's like they want you to read and sit over and over again. This is Paul's story. His entire life is shifted and framed by this encounter. Going to Damascus, looking to persecute those of the way, leaving, joining them, and following Jesus on the way. He answers Jesus in this vision, who are you, Lord? And he said, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said, rise, go to Damascus. There you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me. And he went to Damascus. And so the fact that he's allowed to keep speaking more than a few seconds shows that some of the message is actually being taken by the audience as credible. He would never be allowed to speak more than a couple seconds. And they're captivated and resonating. There's something going on with this man and what his story is. And what's interesting here is that he's emphasizing things that they can relate to. Sometimes we are most afraid to share the gospel and to share the way of Jesus with the people that we're most like. I've found that often many of us, as we're challenged with what does this look like in my life, what you are primarily probably called to bring the gospel to are the people that you are most like. That doesn't mean that you can kind of justify yourself and not take risk going to the people on the outside. Because the beautiful thing is that he's pretty much being almost killed here because he's gone to the Gentile, to the outsider. But what I found even culturally is that many Christians are most uncomfortable navigating their faith with the people they are most like. Like I'm more comfortable sharing with a stranger in line at Trader Joe's, or if I want to invite someone, if we do like an evangelistic outreach, I'll invite my mechanic, because like the worst he can say is no, and I know he's Armenian and he prays. Oh, what about the person that you write with at work, or that you sit next to at the cubicle, that's also from the Midwest and that deconstructed their faith just like you did, but they didn't come back? Have you initiated with them in some way? I don't mean like handed them a track or like guilt tripped them or even invited them to church. I just mean like, have you like factored them out of your engagement because you're like, I don't think they're coming back. I know, because I don't even know how I came back. Or some of you don't give yourself enough credit for how, because of your love for the people that are most like you, you continually engage, not by like forcing the gospel and a prayer down their throat and saying, hey, can I take you to lunch and then make some awkward gospel presentation and force you to say yes or no to some invitation. I don't mean that. I mean, some of you are year after year, month after month, engaging with these people that you have somehow intersected lives with. And you are looking and praying for them and looking for ways to bless them that cost you something. It costs you your time. It can cost you your reputation. It can sometimes cost you your job. I didn't ask permission, so I won't share the name. I haven't gotten an update yet, but I had a lovely conversation with one of you last week. The situation was one where this person had a beautiful situation at work, where a few believers in the core, area, and she said, but there's a new person that I believe had a health condition that was very similar to a health condition she had had at one point. And she also knows that this person is not open to the way of Jesus. And she was going to have a very clear exchange this week with that person and have extra time to engage. And she was all kind of like excited, scared, worked up, expectant, and petrified all at the same time. All these emotions swirling. And I was just like, this is so beautiful. Because as you do your work and your calling, you're not ignoring the people right beside you that God's put there. And what was so unique was there was also a dynamic where this is coming at a time where she's like up for potential promotion, and if something got stirred up with a conversation that went south, it could potentially cost something positive, right? That's what it looks like to engage with the gospel in the modern age. It's always going to cost us something. It's not always clear what it looks like. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do or say this week. She just knew she couldn't ignore being present with this colleague. And that's my invitation. Not have you scratched off what you're supposed to say that, oh, I've been on mission, blah, 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 blah. No one's interested in that. Have you engaged with the culture? Have you found a way to let your heart connect with the hearts of the people that have been put around you? And are you willing to process with the Holy Spirit and say, I don't know what to do. I can't do this in my own strength. I need your heart, your perspective. I need to be reminded of my new identity, because all these other identities that I carry are going to fail me, and I can't depend on them. How do I step in there and be a non-anxious, peacemaking, loving, sacrificial presence? Paul gives us a standard. What are you willing to lay your life down for? What story are you willing to put your life story on? Every single one of us want to live for something that we're willing to die for. Paul's reminding us what that is. And Paul just puts the political and religious tensions of his day right into the framework of ours. Paul can mention both his zeal and his persecuting Christians in the past right beside each other in close proximity as features of his pre-Jesus life without explicitly connecting the two. He's basically not claiming that this is what it means to practice Judaism. He's simply identifying himself with their passions and concerns at a time that is extremely conflicting, both politically and religiously, as well as for him personally. And it couldn't hit us any clearer today. Many of us are so worked up about our religious offenses in the church or our political offenses in the church or outside the church or everywhere. But what's leading us, what's ultimately able to make Paul someone who can bring peace in the midst of chaos is because he doesn't shy away from the conflict because he has no other choice. But there's always a choice in the way that you address the people that disagree with you. And I just want to bring that to the forefront again. How do you address the people that you know don't see the world the same way that you do? Do you respond with some measure of apathy? Do you respond with some measure of just annoyance and obnoxiousness that so defines so much of the church? This kind of like pre-crucified Peter-like zealousness that wants to go chop off ears? Like, do you carry that kind of like, I'll show them, I'll debate with them, I'll do all of these things, instead of Paul's mode of debate was one where it's not really what we think of as debate. It's, how can I find a place for you to connect with me? How do we find a commonality? How can I show you that I see you, that I hear you? And then how can I still not compromise on the way of Jesus? And so he leads them right to the edge. And then when he mentions the area that they're unwilling to compromise on, hell breaks loose. Verse 12. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, which shows that he's a good witness to the audience, was spoken well of by the Jews who were there, came to me, verse 13. Standing by me, he said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. At that very hour, I received my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know this, know his will, to see the righteous one and hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. So he's holding back the thing he knows is going to be offensive as long as he possibly can. When he says for you to be a witness for him to everyone, to them they're hearing everyone. No. But he doesn't compromise on the reality that the way of Jesus is for everyone. This has to be something that stirs us in our witness. How do we lead with sacrificial love, lay our lives down, be willing to take risk, sacrifice our comfort, our time, our reputation, and still not compromise on giving people the fullness of what Jesus is like? Last verse, verse 16. And this is what Ananias said. And now, Paul, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. Paul's testimony. What are you waiting for? He's all of a sudden realized in a matter of moments and days that his entire life's purpose has been murderous hatred and misrepresenting his way of life and his faith. And every shred of his being should then feel the guilt and the shame and the weight of that to such a degree that he couldn't possibly go out on mission immediately. He needs to pay the price for what he's done. He needs to suffer. And the gospel says, why are you waiting to be my witness, to share my love, to tell my story? think many of us have so disqualified ourselves because of our guilt or shame or our voice or our gifts or our abilities. And what the Lord is saying to every single one of us is, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Often I'm waiting for an opportunity that's so obvious that I can't deny it, so that I can put the blame on God. God, give me opportunities today to share you with others. And what I really mean is make it so obvious that I don't really have to do anything. Make this the least amount of faith possible. And basically, I'm not going to do anything unless it's so obvious. But here's the other thing. I can feel you with me going like, oh, but this is so stressful. Being a witness for Jesus is so stressful. Do I have to think about this all the time? I've walked around for so many years feeling guilt that I'm not sharing the gospel more. There's not one single verse in the entire Bible that says, church, if you haven't shared the gospel today, feel guilty. The problem is we have all these testimonies of people. Sue and I went to a school called Moody Bible Institute in downtown Chicago. Dwight Lyman Moody, the founder, D.L. Moody, one of the greatest revivalists of modern era, late 1800s, early 1900s. He's famous for living by this mantra. He said, I dare not go to bed at night until I've shared Christ with at least 10 souls. And you hear that in the right setting, and you're like, come on, let me run through a flipping wall for these people. I'm not going to bed tonight without sharing the gospel with 10 people. And then all of a sudden life happens, and you're like, have I shared the gospel with 10 people in the last 10 years? Do I suck in every way, shape, or form? What is the point of my life? And then without even thinking about it, we're like, oh, thank God for the evangelist. I'm just not one of those. And what we've just done is we've demeaned our own gifts, our own natural abilities. We've compared to the experts and professional ministers. And we've disqualified ourselves from the beautiful, simple, and mundane ways that the kingdom is meant to infiltrate every fabric of culture and society. I want this to be a community that is seething with creative ideas of how we use our gifts and our voices, big and small. We're using our fashion businesses to pick women out of places and to give gospel opportunities that aren't just points of decision, that aren't afraid of them, but they're literally entering into a place where people can tangibly exchange with the love of God. It's the kinds of things where all of a sudden you've got areas, if you're in finance, where you can compromise on some things, but you do not compromise, and people ask you why you're not like everyone else, because you have a standard and an identity that doesn't allow you to be pulled into a way of life. You don't write things the way other people write them. If you're a writer, you don't act or you don't enter into a set in the same way that other people do. You don't compromise in the way that you have relationships with people that are inappropriate. You don't speak about your spouse or your relationship or the people that everyone else is speaking about. And what you do is that you give people a window into something that their soul craves. And you're not ashamed to point them into this reality that you've been covered. You've been shown a transformation in your life where your heart has learned to love and fear something and worship something that reorients every other worship, every other fear, every other love. A different kind of story. What story are you living for? What are you waiting for? Why don't you stand? The team can come up. It's supposed to be a short message, dang it. As I pray for you, just keep these three things that we started with in front of you. No human gets to avoid difficulty and danger in life. No matter the millennia, no matter the culture we live in. How does your faith prepare you for difficulty? Holy Spirit, remind us that you give us access to a different kind of mindset and expectation. We expect difficulty. That's not an invitation of a life of misery. It's a life with purpose. We step in and look to bring peace when everyone else runs away. We step in and look to provide presence and love when everyone else runs from the pain. We reject the idea that we avoid the places where the world needs us to be present with them. I pray every single one of us today would just be given a small little vision of what this means this week to lean in to a fresh mindset, fresh expectations of our life on mission and with purpose. Give us the language of your kingdom that allows us to find commonalities with the people, that compels us to engage instead of isolate from the world. We refuse to be the kind of church where the high water mark of spirituality is coming to everything that we put on, like we're some sort of club to get you out of the world. That's a lie from hell. Our entire purpose is to equip you to engage with the world. May we be a church that is so profoundly convinced of our calling and mission in this world that our core purpose is to send you out, not gather you in. Shift our mindset, shift our language, re-anchor us on our identity. Not rejecting every other identity. I think that's one of the lies that Christians do. We can have all kinds of other things that make up, our identity. It's just that the way of Jesus reframes every other way, every other thing that makes us up. He becomes the center, the anchor, the everything. All of a sudden, I'm still afraid of all the same things. I'm still in love with all the same loves, but they will fail me, and he will not. Your love never fails because it's bigger than my life. It's bigger than my story. Re-anchor us on your story. Make us a people that constantly live remembering the future as we practice your ways in the midst of a culture that wants to see you and wants to know you.